Imagine living in a time when faith was in decline, leaders were corrupt, and idolatry spread like a plague. In this desolate scenario, a man with a divine mission arises, destined to challenge kings, perform miracles, and revive the faith of an entire nation. This man is Elijah, the prophet of Gilead, a figure whose life and works continue to inspire and teach valuable lessons even today. Many have heard of his extraordinary deeds, but few know the depth of his story and the transformative impact he had. Prepare for a journey through time, where each event in Elijah's life teaches us about courage, faith, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Let's discover how the story of this prophet can illuminate our paths and strengthen our spirituality in times of uncertainty. Elijah emerges in the pages of history at a time of great spiritual need. He does not come from a line of priests nor a noble family, but from Gilead, a rugged and inhospitable region. His humble origin contrasts sharply with the grandeur of his mission. When God calls him, Elijah is prepared to face challenges that few would dare. His first great mission is to announce a devastating drought to King Ahab, one of Israel's most wicked kings. This announcement is not just a prophecy but a direct challenge to the king's authority and the false gods he promotes. Armed only with his unwavering faith, Elijah enters the royal court and proclaims the divine message with courage that can only come from someone who knows he is fulfilling God's will. Elijah's message to Ahab is not well received, but the prophet does not back down. He knows he is dealing with a king who has abandoned God's ways to follow the idolatry of Baal, influenced by his wife Jezebel. Elijah understands that the drought he announces is a divine judgment on the nation, an attempt to bring the people back to the true God. Elijah's faith is tested early in his mission, as he must trust that God will sustain him during the drought he himself announced. This period of trial shapes Elijah, strengthening his faith and preparing him for even greater challenges to come. After announcing the drought, God instructs Elijah to hide by the brook Cherith, where he would be sustained in a miraculous way. There, Elijah experiences God's supernatural provision, being fed by ravens that bring him bread and meat every day. This experience reinforces Elijah's confidence in God's faithfulness, showing that God cares for his servants even in the most difficult times. The brook Cherith becomes a symbol of God's provision in times of need, reminding us that even when we face scarcity, we can trust that God will provide. When the brook dries up, God directs Elijah to go to Zarephath, a city outside Israel, where a widow will care for him. This instruction is surprising because Zarephath is in pagan territory, and a widow is the last person one would expect to sustain someone during a famine. However, Elijah obeys, and this journey not only tests his obedience, but also expands his vision of God's grace and provision. In Zarephath, Elijah will face new challenges and miracles that will continue to shape his faith and his mission. By presenting himself before King Ahab, Elijah not only challenges a monarch but an entire system of idolatrous worship. Ahab, encouraged by his wife Jezebel, had promoted the worship of Baal, a Canaanite god, leading the people of Israel to stray from God's commandments. Idolatry had become so prevalent that the prophets of the Lord were persecuted and killed. In this context, Elijah emerges as a beacon of spiritual resistance, determined to restore true worship in Israel. His message to the king is clear and relentless. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. This declaration is an act of tremendous boldness, for challenging the authority of a king could result in immediate death. However, Elijah trusts completely in God and is willing to risk his life to fulfill his mission. The drought he prophesies is not just a natural phenomenon but a divine judgment, intended to show the futility of Baal worship, who was supposedly the god of fertility and rain. Through this drought, God demonstrates his power over the elements and directly challenges the authority of the false gods that Ahab and Jezebel worshipped. During the years of drought, Elijah becomes a fugitive, constantly pursued by the king's forces. His life is in constant danger, but he finds refuge and sustenance in the most unexpected ways. First, God hides him by the brook Cherith, where he is fed by ravens. Then, he is sent to Zarephath, where an unbelieving widow becomes his instrument of provision. These experiences not only sustain Elijah physically but also reinforce his faith in God's provision and sovereignty. Each act of miraculous provision is a reminder that God is in control, even in times of extreme difficulty. The drought finally ends, but not before one of the most dramatic events in Elijah's life, the confrontation on Mount Carmel. God orders Elijah to present himself to Ahab again, promising to send rain upon the earth. Elijah obeys and challenges the prophets of Baal to a duel of faith. On Mount Carmel, before all Israel, Elijah challenges the 450 prophets of Baal to call on their God to ignite a sacrifice with fire. When Baal does not respond, Elijah prays to God, and fire from heaven consumes his sacrifice, proving once and for all that the Lord is the true God. This event not only reaffirms Elijah's faith but also leads the people to recognize God's sovereignty, preparing the way for Israel's spiritual restoration. After announcing the drought to King Ahab, Elijah receives an unusual divine instruction to hide by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan. This period of isolation and total dependence on God is crucial for shaping the prophet's character and strengthening his faith. At the brook Cherith, Elijah experiences God's supernatural provision in a way few could imagine. Ravens, birds usually associated with impurity, are chosen by God to bring bread and meat to the prophet twice a day. This daily miracle is a powerful testimony of God's ability to use the most unlikely means to sustain his servants. The choice of ravens as instruments of divine provision is full of significance. In Hebrew culture, ravens were considered unclean, but God, in his sovereignty, uses these birds to show that he can use any means to fulfill his purposes. For Elijah, each meal brought by the ravens is a constant reminder of God's faithfulness, even in times of adversity. The brook Cherith becomes a place of deep learning about trust in God. Elijah learns that when God calls us to a task, he also provides the necessary resources to complete it, even if those resources come from unexpected sources. Elijah's time at the brook Cherith also symbolizes a period of preparation and spiritual strengthening. Isolated from the outside world, Elijah has the opportunity to focus entirely on his relationship with God. This forced isolation, away from the distractions and pressures of daily life, allows Elijah to deepen his faith and depend completely on God for every need. This period of solitude and divine provision is a prelude to the great challenges Elijah will face later. It is a time of renewal and strengthening, where Elijah is molded and prepared for the next phase of his mission. When the brook finally dries up, it is a sign that Elijah's preparation phase has ended and that he must move on to new challenges. God does not allow Elijah to remain comfortable for long in a situation of miraculous provision. Instead, he continues to guide him to new tasks and greater tests of faith. This episode teaches a valuable lesson about the transient nature of God's provision. Although he always cares for us, he also calls us to keep moving forward in our journey of faith, trusting that he will provide what we need at each stage of the way. After leaving the brook Cherith, Elijah receives a new order from God to go to Zarephath, a Phoenician city outside Israel, where a widow would care for him. This instruction seems absurd at first, as a widow, especially during a drought, would be among the most vulnerable and least able to sustain someone. However, Elijah obeys without question, showing his total trust in God's provision. Upon arriving in Zarephath, Elijah finds the widow exactly as God had said. She is gathering wood to prepare what she believes to be her last meal before dying of hunger with her son. Elijah, however, challenges her to make a bread for him first, promising that the God of Israel would not let her flour and oil run out until the rain returns to the land. The widow of Zarephath is in a desperate situation but decides to trust the prophet's words. This act of faith is miraculously rewarded. As Elijah prophesied, the widow's flour and oil do not run out, and she, her son, and Elijah are sustained throughout the drought. This miracle is not just a testimony of God's power, but also a lesson about the importance of faith and obedience. The widow, a foreigner outside the people of Israel, demonstrates a faith that many Israelites had lost. Her willingness to believe in Elijah's word and act accordingly results in continuous provision and sustenance. The miracle of the flour and oil in Zarephath also has a profound spiritual meaning. It teaches us that when we place our needs in God's hands and trust Him, He is able to provide in ways we cannot imagine. The story of the widow and Elijah defies human logic and encourages us to trust God even when circumstances seem impossible. God not only provided physically for the widow but also demonstrated His compassion and care for all who seek Him, regardless of their origin or social status. After the miracle of the continuous provision of flour and oil, the faith of the widow of Zarephath is again tested drastically. Her son falls seriously ill and, despite all efforts, dies. The widow, consumed by grief, turns to Elijah in despair, questioning whether the prophet's presence brought misfortune upon them. She wonders if her sins were revealed and punished through her son's death. This moment of anguish and questioning reflects a crisis of faith, where the widow struggles to understand God's purpose amid suffering. The situation becomes a test not only for her but also for Elijah, who finds himself confronted with the need to intercede powerfully for a miracle. Elijah, deeply moved by the widow's pain, takes the boy's body and climbs to his room, where he places the boy on his bed. He cries out to the Lord, expressing his own perplexity. "O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodge by killing her son?" Elijah then stretches himself over the boy 3 times and implores God to bring the child's soul back to him. This act of intense supplication is an example of fervent prayer and intercession. Elijah not only asks God for a miracle but also demonstrates his total dependence and trust in God's power to reverse even death. The miracle occurs in an extraordinary way. God hears Elijah's cry, and the child's soul returns to him, reviving him. Elijah then descends with the living child and hands him over to his mother, saying, "See, your son lives." This moment is not just a victory over death but a powerful confirmation of Elijah's ministry. The widow, upon seeing her son alive again, declares, "Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." This acknowledgement underlines Elijah's prophetic authority and the truth of God's message he proclaims. The boy's resurrection is a living testimony of God's compassion and power, reaffirming the widow's faith and Elijah's mission. This episode has profound spiritual implications. The resurrection of the widow's son points to God's power over life and death, prefiguring the future resurrection fully realized in Jesus Christ. For modern readers, this story offers hope and encouragement. It reminds us that even in the most desperate situations, God has the power to bring life and restoration. The faith demonstrated by Elijah and the widow's transformation challenge us to trust God in all circumstances, knowing that He is capable of performing miracles in our lives as well. One of the most dramatic moments in Elijah's life occurs on Mount Carmel, where he directly confronts the prophets of Baal in an epic showdown. After years of drought, Elijah returns to King Ahab with a message from God. The rain is about to return, but first, a confrontation is needed to decide who is the true God of Israel. Elijah gathers all the people of Israel and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel for a duel of faith. The scene is set for a spectacle that will determine the true deity and reaffirm the people's faith in God. The challenge is simple. Each side will prepare a sacrifice but will not light the fire. The God who answers with fire is the true God. The prophets of Baal, numbering 450, begin to call on their God from morning until noon, dancing and shouting, but there is no response. Elijah, observing the futility of their efforts, begins to mock them, suggesting that perhaps Baal is busy, traveling, or sleeping. This act of provocation is not just a tactic to demoralize the prophets of Baal, but also a demonstration of Elijah's absolute confidence in God's power. As the prophets of Baal intensify their rituals, cutting themselves until they bleed, the silence continues, demonstrating Baal's impotence before the true God of Israel. Then it is Elijah's turn. He invites the people to come closer and begins to rebuild the altar of the Lord that was in ruins, using 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Elijah prepares the sacrifice and, to make the miracle even more impressive, orders large amounts of water to be poured over the altar and the offering, completely soaking the wood and the sacrifice. When everything is ready, Elijah approaches and prays to the Lord, asking God to answer so that the people may know that He is the true God and that Elijah is His servant. God's response is immediate and powerful. Fire descends from heaven and consumes the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water in the trench around the altar. The people, witnessing this incredible miracle, fall on their faces and exclaim, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" This event not only defeats the prophets of Baal but also reaffirms the people's faith in the one true God. Elijah orders the capture and execution of the prophets of Baal, eliminating the idolatrous influence from Israel. The challenge on Mount Carmel is a turning point in Israel's spiritual history, demonstrating God's uncontested power and the effectiveness of fervent intercession. The event on Mount Carmel not only proves God's superiority over Baal, but also serves as a public and undeniable demonstration of divine power. When fire from heaven consumes the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water, it is an overwhelming victory for God and a devastating blow to idolatry. This event is a testimony not only to the Israelites present but also to all future generations. The message is clear: the Lord is the only true God, and He answers the prayers of His faithful servants. God's victory on Mount Carmel revives the people's faith and restores the honor of God's name in Israel. Elijah's prayer on Mount Carmel is short but deeply powerful. He does not make a long supplication but simply asks God to show the people that He is the true God and that Elijah is His servant. This direct and faith-filled prayer is an example of how we should pray, with confidence and clarity, knowing that God hears and responds. God's response with fire from heaven is not only a confirmation of Elijah's mission but also proof that God is present and active in the history of His people. This event teaches us that true worship and faith are rewarded with God's manifest presence. God's victory on Mount Carmel has an immediate and lasting impact. The Israelites, witnessing God's power, turned to Him in worship and repentance. They publicly acknowledged that the Lord, He is God. This acknowledgement is a crucial step for Israel's spiritual restoration. Elijah's act of eliminating the prophets of Baal is a symbol of the eradication of idolatry and a return to the purity of faith in God. This event serves as a call for all of us to remove any form of idolatry from our lives and to worship only the Lord with all our hearts. Beyond the spiritual impact, the victory on Mount Carmel also has practical implications. After the fire from heaven consumes the sacrifice, Elijah prophesies the coming of rain, ending the devastating drought. He climbs to the top of the mountain, prostrates himself in prayer, and repeatedly sends his servant to look toward the sea for a sign. Finally, a small cloud appears, quickly growing into a torrential storm, bringing rain to the land. This restoration of rain is not only physical relief for the parched land, but also a symbol of spiritual renewal and divine blessing. God's victory on Mount Carmel reminds us that true faith results in transformation and renewal, both spiritually and practically. After the dramatic confrontation on Mount Carmel and the manifest divine intervention with fire from heaven, Elijah takes decisive action against idolatry in Israel. He orders that the prophets of Baal, who had deceived and led the people into sin, be captured and brought to the brook Kishon, where they are executed. This action may seem severe to modern eyes, but it is a necessary measure to purge the nation of the corrupt and deadly influence of idolatry. The prophets of Baal were not just religious leaders but agents of spiritual, moral, and social corruption. Their elimination is seen as divine justice, necessary for the restoration of true worship in Israel. The execution of the prophets of Baal serves as a powerful symbol of repentance and renewal. By eliminating these false prophets, Elijah is helping to restore Israel's covenant with God. This extreme act is a reminder that sin and idolatry have serious consequences, and that true worship requires purity and commitment. For the people of Israel, witnessing the fall of the prophets of Baal is a call to repentance and an invitation to return to the Lord with sincere hearts. This event highlights the need for decisive actions when dealing with sin and idolatry in our own lives. The slaughter of the prophets of Baal also sends a clear message to the remaining followers of Baal and the undecided. God's direct intervention on Mount Carmel and the subsequent elimination of the false prophets demonstrate unequivocally who the true God is. This act of divine justice serves to deter others from following the paths of idolatry and reaffirms God's authority over all creation. For Elijah, this is a moment of spiritual triumph, but also a reminder of the heavy burden of being a prophet of God, responsible not only for proclaiming the truth, but also for executing divine justice. Finally, the slaughter of the prophets of Baal paves the way for the promised rain. With idolatry eliminated, Elijah climbs to the top of Mount Carmel and prostrates himself in prayer, waiting for the sign of rain. Elijah's persistence in prayer, sending his servant repeatedly to check the horizon, shows his unwavering faith in God's promise. When the small cloud finally appears, It quickly grows into a torrential storm, ending the long drought. This outcome not only brings physical relief to the parched land, but also symbolizes spiritual renewal and God's blessing upon a people who have returned to Him. After the victory on Mount Carmel and the elimination of the prophets of Baal, Elijah turns to a new challenge, bringing back the rain to a drought-stricken land. Elijah warns King Ahab to prepare because the rain is coming. However, instead of simply waiting for the rain, Elijah climbs to the top of Mount Carmel, prostrates himself on the ground, and begins to pray fervently. This act of humility and supplication shows the depth of Elijah's faith and his total dependence on God. He knows that although the spiritual victory has been won, physical restoration still depends on divine intervention. Elijah's prayer is persistent and fervent. He sends his servant to look toward the sea 7 times in search of a sign. Each time the servant returns with no news, Elijah continues praying, undeterred. This persistence is a powerful example of faith in action. Elijah does not doubt God's promise but understands that the answer may not be immediate. He continues praying until finally, on the 7th time, the servant sees a small cloud the size of a man's hand. This small sign is enough for Elijah. He knows that the great rain is about to come and warns Ahab to descend from the mountain before the storm overtakes him. When the small cloud rapidly transforms into a great storm, the response to Elijah's prayer is evident. The dry and cracked land begins to receive the long-awaited rain, bringing life and renewal. This event is more than just a meteorological phenomenon. It is a manifestation of God's mercy and power in response to faith and prayer. For the Israelites, the rain is a tangible sign that God has not only heard their prayers but is also ready to restore the land and the people. Elijah's faith and his willingness to pray until he sees the answer teach us about the importance of perseverance in prayer and trusting in God's promises. The restoration of rain after the confrontation on Mount Carmel symbolizes a new era of blessing and prosperity for Israel. The people who had turned back to God in repentance now see the physical evidence of God's faithfulness. The land begins to flourish again, and the drought becomes a distant memory. For Elijah, this moment is a confirmation of his mission and a testimony that faith in God is never in vain. His life teaches us that even in times of great spiritual or physical drought, persistent faith and fervent prayer can bring rain and renewal. It is a lesson that resonates to this day, reminding us never to give up trusting God, regardless of the circumstances. After the victory on Mount Carmel and the restoration of rain, Elijah faces a new and dangerous adversary. Jezebel, the idolatrous queen and wife of Ahab, becomes furious upon learning of the death of the prophets of Baal and vows vengeance against Elijah. She sends a message to the prophet, threatening to kill him within 24 hours. This warning, filled with hatred and a death threat, awakens a deep fear in Elijah. Despite his previous spiritual victories, Elijah finds himself in a moment of human vulnerability. He flees to save his life, going to Beersheba in Judah and leaving his servant behind. Elijah's flight to the desert is marked by a profound sense of despair and exhaustion. He walks a day's journey and finally sits under a broom tree, asking God to take his life. Elijah, who had faced kings and false prophets with unwavering courage, is now consumed by fear and desolation. He says, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." This moment of crisis reveals Elijah's humanity, showing that even the greatest men of God can face moments of deep anguish and hopelessness. As Elijah sleeps under the broom tree, an angel of the Lord touches him and tells him to arise and eat. When he awakens, Elijah finds a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water beside him. He eats and drinks, but still exhausted, he lies down again. The angel returns a second time, touches Elijah again, and encourages him to eat, for the journey ahead is long. Elijah obeys, and with the strength from that food, he travels for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, the Mount of God. This period of physical and spiritual renewal in the desert prepares Elijah for a transformative encounter with God. On Mount Horeb, Elijah takes refuge in a cave, and there, God asks him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" In his response, Elijah expresses his deep frustration and feeling of isolation. "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." God then manifests himself to Elijah not in a strong wind, nor in an earthquake or fire, but in a still, small voice. This divine encounter reaffirms God's constant presence and renews Elijah's mission, reminding him that he is not alone, for there are still 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed to Baal. On Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, Elijah has a transformative encounter with God. Taking refuge in a cave, he experiences a unique divine manifestation. God instructs Elijah to go out and stand on the mount, for the Lord is about to pass by. The prophet witnesses a series of powerful events: a strong and mighty wind that tears the mountains and breaks rocks, an earthquake, and a fire. However, God is not present in any of these spectacular events. Instead, after the fire, Elijah hears a still, small voice, a gentle whisper that represents God's presence. This moment reveals a profound truth about God's nature. He often reveals himself not through grand displays of power, but in moments of quiet and peace. Upon hearing the still, small voice, Elijah covers his face with his cloak in reverence and steps out of the cave to listen to God's voice. The question God asks Elijah, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" is repeated. Elijah responds again, expressing his zeal for the Lord and his feeling of isolation and failure. He feels alone in his struggle against idolatry and believes he is the only prophet left. This dialogue between Elijah and God is crucial as it allows Elijah to express his pain and hopelessness, while God, in his patience and compassion, listens and responds. God then gives Elijah new instructions, revitalizing his prophetic mission. He is to anoint Hazael as king over Syria, Jehu as king over Israel, and Elisha as his successor. These instructions not only provide Elijah with new direction and purpose, but also ensure that God's work will continue through other leaders. God reveals to Elijah that there are still 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed to Baal. This revelation is a tremendous comfort to Elijah, reminding him that he is not alone in his faithfulness. This encounter on Mount Horeb transforms Elijah's perspective, renewing his courage and determination to continue his mission. This episode on Mount Horeb has deep lessons for modern life. Often, we seek God in grand and miraculous events, expecting spectacular signs of his presence. However, Elijah's story teaches us that God is also present in the quiet and gentle whispers of our lives. He calls us to a relationship of intimacy and stillness, where we can hear his voice and receive his instructions. This encounter challenges us to seek God's presence not only in great moments but also in silence and stillness, where he often speaks most clearly and intimately. After the transformative encounter on Mount Horeb, God gives Elijah a new mission, including the crucial task of anointing Elisha as his successor. Elijah obeys immediately and sets out to find Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who is plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. Upon finding Elisha, Elijah throws his cloak over him, a symbolic act indicating the transfer of the prophetic calling. Elisha understands the significance of this gesture and asks permission to say goodbye to his parents before following Elijah. This moment marks the beginning of a new phase in Elijah's mission and the continuation of his legacy through Elisha. Elisha, in accepting Elijah's cloak, demonstrates a deep and total commitment. He sacrifices the oxen he was plowing with and offers the meat to the people, symbolizing the end of his old life and the beginning of a new journey as a servant of God. This act of sacrifice and farewell is a powerful testimony to his willingness to follow God's call without reservation. Elisha leaves behind everything he knew and embarks on a path of service and learning alongside Elijah. This kind of radical commitment is an inspiring example of faith and obedience. The relationship between Elijah and Elisha is marked by a deep bond of mentor and apprentice. Elisha accompanies Elijah on his travels and witnesses the miracles and power of God through his master's ministry. This period of learning and growth is crucial for Elisha as he prepares to take on the prophetic mantle from Elijah. Elijah's mentorship offers Elisha not only knowledge and skills, but also a living example of faith, courage, and devotion to God. Through his time with Elijah, Elisha is shaped and prepared to continue God's work in Israel. The choice of Elisha as Elijah's successor and the formation of this partnership have profound implications for the continuity of the prophetic ministry in Israel. This act of succession not only ensures that God's message will continue to be proclaimed, but also establishes a model for the transmission of spiritual wisdom and knowledge. The relationship between Elijah and Elisha teaches us the importance of mentorship and discipleship in spiritual life. Just as Elijah invested in Elisha, we are called to invest in the next generations, sharing our faith, experiences, and learnings so that God's work may continue to thrive. When Elijah finds Elisha, he is busy with his daily tasks, plowing the field with 12 yoke of oxen. This seemingly mundane detail reveals much about Elisha's character. He is hardworking, dedicated, and committed to his responsibilities. However, when Elijah throws his cloak over him, Elisha immediately understands the significance of the gesture and the magnitude of the call. He does not hesitate to ask for permission to say goodbye to his parents, showing respect for his family and the impact of the decision he is about to make. This moment of transition is critical, as it marks the beginning of a new life for Elisha, a life of service to God. The sacrifice of the oxen by Elisha symbolizes his total surrender to God's call. By sacrificing the animals he was working with and sharing the meat with the people, Elisha not only bids farewell to his old life, but also celebrates the beginning of his new journey. This act of sacrifice is a public testimony of his decision and a gesture of generosity and communion. For Elisha, following Elijah means leaving behind the security and familiarity of his previous life to embark on an uncertain but purposeful journey of service to God. This kind of radical commitment is an inspiring example of faith and obedience. Elisha's decision to follow Elijah is not made lightly. He understands the seriousness of the call and the magnitude of the mission that awaits him. This commitment is reflected in his readiness to leave everything behind and follow Elijah without looking back. From this moment on, Elisha becomes a dedicated apprentice, accompanying Elijah on his travels and learning from him the art of prophetic ministry. Elisha's willingness to learn and grow spiritually under Elijah's mentorship is an example of humility and determination. He is willing to undergo rigorous training and prepare for the great responsibility he will assume in the future. The transition from Elijah to Elisha is a powerful testimony to the continuity of the divine call. Even when a great prophet is about to leave the scene, God has already prepared a successor to continue his work. This process of succession ensures that God's message continues to be proclaimed and that the people of Israel continue to be guided by faithful spiritual leaders. For us, this story highlights the importance of being prepared to take on new responsibilities and to continue the work of those who came before us. Elisha's call is a reminder that God always has a plan and that he calls us to be part of that plan with faith and courage. As Elijah's final days approach, he and Elisha travel together from Gilgal to Bethel, from Bethel to Jericho, and finally to the Jordan. At each place, the sons of the prophets approach Elisha, asking if he knows that the Lord will take Elijah away that day. Elisha repeatedly responds for them to remain silent, showing his determination to stay by Elijah's side until the end. This final journey is filled with meaning and emotion, as it marks the transition from Elijah's ministry to Elisha's. Elisha's loyalty in following Elijah to the end demonstrates his deep commitment to his master and the divine mission he will inherit. At the Jordan, Elijah performs one last miracle by striking the waters with his cloak, dividing them so that he and Elisha can cross on dry ground. This miraculous act is a powerful symbol of Elijah's ministry and a foreshadowing of what is to come for Elisha. Upon reaching the other side, Elijah asks Elisha what he desires before being taken away. Elisha, in an audacious request, asks for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. This request is not for power or glory, but for the necessary empowerment to continue the prophetic mission with the same effectiveness and fervor as his master. Elijah responds that Elisha will have his desire if he witnesses his departure. As they walk and talk, suddenly a chariot of fire with horses of fire appears and separates Elijah from Elisha. Elijah is taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, a spectacular vision that confirms God's presence and power. Elisha, witnessing this extraordinary event, cries out in admiration and sorrow, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." This cry expresses both personal loss and recognition of Elijah's crucial role in Israel's history. Seeing Elijah disappear into heaven, Elisha tears his clothes in an act of mourning and respect, symbolizing the end of an era and the beginning of another. After Elijah's ascension, Elisha returns to the Jordan and performs his first miracle alone. He takes Elijah's cloak that fell and strikes the waters, asking, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The waters divide again, confirming that Elijah's spirit now rests on Elisha. This initial miracle serves as a validation of Elisha's succession and the continued power of God in his life. The sons of the prophets, seeing this sign, recognize that Elijah's spirit rests on Elisha and submit to him as the new spiritual leader. This transition is marked by signs and wonders, ensuring that God's work will continue through Elisha. The miracle at the Jordan, performed by Elijah and then repeated by Elisha, is an event of great symbolic and spiritual significance. When Elijah prepares for his ascension, he and Elisha find themselves at the edge of the Jordan River. In a prophetic gesture, Elijah removes his cloak, folds it, and strikes the waters, which divide, allowing both to cross on dry ground. This miraculous act not only demonstrates God's power operating through Elijah, but also prepares the way for the spiritual and symbolic transition of leadership to Elisha. As they cross the Jordan, Elijah and Elisha enter into a spiritual and symbolic territory, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. After Elijah's ascension, Elisha returns to the Jordan with his master's cloak. This moment is crucial for Elisha, as he must now demonstrate that he has inherited Elijah's spirit and authority. Upon reaching the banks of the river, Elisha cries out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" and strikes the waters with the cloak. The waters divide again, confirming that the same power that operated in Elijah now rests upon Elisha. This initial miracle serves as a divine seal of approval on Elisha's ministry, validating his position as the new prophetic leader of Israel. The repetition of the miracle at the Jordan is a powerful confirmation of the continuity of the divine call. The sons of the prophets, who were observing from a distance, witness Elisha's miracle and recognize that Elijah's spirit rests on him. They approach Elisha and bow before him, accepting his leadership and spiritual authority. This public recognition is crucial for Elisha, as he needs the trust and support of the prophetic community to fulfill his mission. The acceptance of Elisha by the sons of the prophets ensures that God's work will continue effectively and that the divine message will be proclaimed without interruption. This moment of transition is marked by a combination of miracles, recognition, and divine confirmation. The miracle at the Jordan also carries a broader spiritual message. It reminds us that God is faithful through all generations and that his power transcends specific individuals. Although Elijah was taken up to heaven, God's power remains present and active through Elisha. This event teaches us that even when great spiritual leaders depart, God continues to raise new servants to carry on his work. The division of the waters at the Jordan symbolizes the passage to new opportunities and challenges, and Elisha's faith in replicating Elijah's miracle demonstrates that with God, we can overcome barriers and move forward in our spiritual journey. When Elijah is about to be taken up to heaven, he offers Elisha the opportunity to make a final request. Elisha, aware of the magnitude of the prophetic call and the responsibility he is about to assume, makes a bold request. He asks for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. This request is not for power or prestige, but for the necessary empowerment to effectively fulfill his mission. Elisha understands that the task ahead will be arduous, and that he will need an extra measure of grace, power, and divine wisdom to lead the people of Israel and continue the work begun by Elijah. The request for a double portion of Elijah's spirit has deep roots in biblical tradition. In Hebrew culture, the double portion was the inheritance given to the firstborn son, symbolizing his additional responsibility and leadership role in the family. By making this request, Elisha is essentially asking to be recognized as Elijah's spiritual heir, with all the responsibilities and challenges that implies. He desires not only to continue Elijah's ministry, but also to expand it and take it to new heights. This request reflects Elisha's humility and awareness of his own limitations and his total dependence on God to fulfill his calling. When Elijah hears Elisha's request, he responds that it is a difficult thing to ask, but that it will be granted if Elisha sees him when he is taken away. This condition highlights the importance of spiritual vision and perception in the life of a prophet. Elisha must be attentive and spiritually tuned to witness the supernatural event of Elijah's ascension. This requirement is not just a test of physical observation but also of spiritual discernment. By remaining by Elijah's side and seeing his departure, Elisha demonstrates his readiness and his ability to capture his master's vision and mission, thus ensuring that he will be endowed with the necessary spirit to lead. Elisha's desire for a double portion of Elijah's spirit teaches us valuable lessons about spiritual ambition and dependence on God. Elisha does not seek greatness for himself but to better serve God's people. His request challenges us to seek spiritual empowerment not for our personal benefit but to fulfill the divine mission more effectively. This story encourages us to ask God for an increase of His Spirit in our lives, knowing that, just as He answered Elisha, He is also willing to endow us with what we need to face our own challenges and fulfill our purpose. Elijah's ascension to heaven is one of the most extraordinary and memorable events in the Bible. As Elijah and Elisha continue their walk and conversation, a chariot of fire drawn by horses of fire suddenly appears, separating the two. Elijah is taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, a vision that witnesses the glory and power of God in a spectacular way. This event not only marks the end of Elijah's earthly ministry but also serves as a powerful confirmation of God's presence and Elijah's prophetic mission. For Elisha, witnessing his master's ascension is a moment of mixed admiration, sorrow, and confirmation of the divine call. The image of the chariot of fire and the horses of fire is rich in symbolism. Fire, often associated with God's presence and power, indicates that Elijah is being taken directly into the divine presence. This event also echoes the separation that Moses experienced when he was taken by God on Mount Nebo, although in a less dramatic way. Elijah's ascension in a chariot of fire reinforces his position as one of Israel's greatest prophets and highlights the supernatural nature of his ministry. This miraculous event serves to inspire and strengthen the faith of those who witness and hear about it. Elisha, seeing his master taken up to heaven, cries out, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." This cry is an expression of respect, admiration, and loss. Elijah was not just a mentor to Elisha but also a spiritual father figure. Elijah's departure leaves a void that Elisha must now fill. By tearing his clothes in mourning, Elisha demonstrates his grief over the loss, but also his acceptance of the new role he must assume. Elijah's ascension marks the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new phase of leadership and ministry for Elisha. Elijah's ascension teaches us profound lessons about the divine call and leadership transition. God does not leave His people without guidance. When one leader is taken, another is prepared to continue the work. This event also reminds us that earthly life is only part of our existence, and that those who serve God faithfully have an eternal destiny with Him. For believers today, Elijah's ascension is a powerful reminder of the glory that awaits us and the importance of being faithful in our calling, knowing that God will reward us and bring us into His presence at the right time. After Elijah's dramatic ascension, Elisha finds himself alone but equipped with his master's cloak and a double portion of his spirit. The first test of his new ministry comes immediately. Returning to the Jordan, Elisha uses Elijah's cloak to strike the waters and asks, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The waters divide, and Elisha crosses on dry ground, just as Elijah had done before. This initial miracle serves as a public confirmation of Elisha's call and the power of God now operating through him. The sons of the prophets, witnessing this act, recognize that Elijah's spirit rests on Elisha and submit to his leadership. With the recognition of the sons of the prophets, Elisha assumes his role as the principal prophet of Israel. His first significant mission occurs in Jericho, where the city's inhabitants ask for his help. Jericho's water was contaminated, making the land infertile. In response, Elisha asks for a new bowl with salt. He goes to the spring of water and throws the salt, declaring that the Lord has purified the waters. The miracle happens, and the water becomes drinkable and healthy again. This act not only demonstrates God's power operating through Elisha but also His compassion and concern for the people's needs. The purification of Jericho's waters is a symbol of renewal and restoration, a central theme in Elisha's ministry. Elisha continues to perform miracles that reflect both God's power and His care for ordinary people. He multiplies a widow's oil to pay her debts, saves a group of prophets from poisoning during a meal, and feeds 100 men with 20 barley loaves, miraculously multiplying them. Each of these miracles reinforces the message that God is present and active in the lives of his people, providing for their needs and answering their prayers. Elisha's ministry, like Elijah's, is marked by divine interventions that confirm faith and encourage the people to trust in the Lord. The beginning of Elisha's ministry is a period of consolidation and affirmation. He needs not only to perform miracles but also to establish his spiritual authority in a nation still recovering from idolatry and corruption. His leadership is challenged, but he stands firm, guided by the Spirit he received. Elisha distinguishes himself not only as a miracle worker, but also as a spiritual leader who guides and inspires the people of Israel to return to true worship of God. The promising start of his ministry lays the foundation for a lasting legacy of faith and obedience, showing that God's work continues from generation to generation. The legacy of Elijah and Elisha is a powerful testimony to God's faithfulness and the lasting impact of dedicated servants. Elijah, with his courage and zeal, faced kings and false prophets, performing miracles that demonstrated God's power and called the people of Israel to repentance. His ascension in a chariot of fire is one of the most memorable scenes in Scripture, symbolizing his triumphant entry into the divine presence. Elisha, his successor, continued this mission with a double portion of Elijah's spirit, performing miracles that brought healing, provision, and renewal to the people. Together, their lives and ministries show that God never abandons his people and always raises leaders to guide them. The story of Elijah and Elisha teaches us about the importance of obedience and unwavering faith. Elijah, in his determination to fulfill God's will, faced adversity with courage and confidence, knowing that God was with him. Elisha, in asking for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, showed his deep awareness of the responsibility he was assuming and his total dependence on God to fulfill his mission. This leadership transition reminds us that God's call is continuous and that he always empowers those he calls to carry out his work. The life lessons from Elijah and Elisha are applicable to us today. They show us that regardless of the challenges we face, we can trust that God is in control and that he will provide what we need to fulfill our purpose. Their miracles of provision, healing, and renewal encourage us to seek God in prayer, knowing that he hears and responds. Moreover, their willingness to invest in others and prepare the next generation challenges us to do the same, ensuring that God's message continues to be proclaimed. Reflecting on the legacy of Elijah and Elisha, we are inspired to live with bold faith, persistent prayer, and total obedience. They remind us that our faithfulness to God can have a lasting impact not only on our lives but also on the lives of those around us. May their stories motivate us to seek a deeper relationship with God and to serve with dedication, knowing that our labor in the Lord is not in vain. The legacy of these great prophets is a beacon of light that continues to guide and inspire, showing that with God, all things are possible.